Distinguished colleagues, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, West Asia has been continuously in our consciousness over the last several decades, but every day brings a new development and astonishes us. The contemporary narrative relating to the region possibly commences from 2011, from the Arab Spring. Of course, the roots of every development are linked with something that happened earlier. And if you keep on going back, you never know where you should put your starting point. Many of us would think in terms of starting from the arrangements in West Asia after the First World War, the broadly, the various arrangements which are collectively referred to as the Versailles arrangements. Or you could come rapidly forward to the Iranian Revolution, or you could have 9/11, or the assault upon Iraq in 2003. But all of those are linked actually, all of them are relevant. But what we have today, the scenario relating to confrontation and conflict, strictly speaking, emerges from what happened in 2011. Now, in the case of 2011, it brought together two challenges for Saudi Arabia. One was what it saw as the expanding influence of Iran across West Asia. It had already witnessed this in the case of Iraq in 2003. And then once you had a domestic challenge in terms of demand for reform at home, the loss of a strategic partner in Hosni Mubarak, and then the demand for reform in Bahrain right at your doorstep. So a collection, a coming together of three serious challenges then instigated Saudi Arabia to give up its traditional policy of moderation and behind the scenes diplomacy and embark on a robust, proactive and indeed aggressive posture in the region, confronting Iran, demonizing Iran for its hegemonic intentions and for spreading the sectarian creed with which it is associated. It has led to two conflict scenarios, two theaters of conflict, Syria and Yemen. Syria is a more indirect conflict. There you have Saudi Arabia has identified the Assad regime as Alawi and therefore Shia and therefore associated with Iran. And then of course you have the relationship pertaining to the Houthis in Yemen. Both are seeing extraordinary. More and more the conflicts in the region are being defined in sectarian terms, and today sectarianism is deeply embedded in the consciousness of the people and in the various public statements of the media and of scholars and very frequently of officials themselves, and also it is defining the various ways in which they look at each other in terms of us and them. The second is the scourge of jihad. Just when we thought that the Arab Spring would put jihad on the back burner, you find that the various conflicts that have happened in the region, where states have broken down and have opened opportunities for extremists to enter, vacuums have been created and spaces and opportunities created for them to get in. You find today not just that the Al-Qaeda has been rejuvenated, you also see a new phenomenon, the ISIS. The ISIS effectively represents the next generation of jihad. Their leader and many of their followers are young people, familiar with social media. They have very different understanding and consciousness of their own role in the region and in world affairs, and they therefore are a very serious challenge to what has gone before, even in terms of jihad. Third is a very interesting set of developments pertaining to the major powers. The United States, that used to loom large in the region, indeed had a hegemonic role, an interventionist role, a military role in the region, seems to be floundering for a policy. Very often they say that non-intervention is possibly the best policy. There is opinion divided in Washington and in the rest of the USA about whether he is the most effective president we've had, the best president we've had as far as West Asia is concerned, or the worst president that we have had as far as West Asia is concerned. In any case, it seems as if they have not yet defined their role. They sometimes appear to be proactive and intervene militarily, and sometimes they tend to stand back. And this has also redefined United States' relationship with the major countries of the region, number one Iran and number two Saudi Arabia. And then you have the intervention of Russia. Russia, that used to be a non-player on the margins of the region, today is not only a major political player at the United States, at the United Nations and in the region, it is also a military participant in what is happening here. Where do we go from here? So the issues that we will consider today is, what is going to happen? Is it going to be continued war? Will there be a direct war now between the two principal Islamic role players in the region? Will there be a sort of stalemate where you will have a continuing tension, maybe escalating tension, but possibly no direct war? Or can we imagine a scenario in which there will be engagement between the two of them and a promotion of regional stability? And finally, what does all this mean for India? India has direct, crucial interests in this region in terms of its energy security, in terms of its economic interests, and the presence of its people, 8 million strong today. We have very, very strong interests, and we are therefore challenged by what kind of role do we do? Do we continue to be bystanders as we have been, reaping the benefits of security, or in a scenario of serious instability? Is there something that we can consider, something that we have never done before? Directly intervene in another region, possibly in tandem with certain other role players, and see how diplomatically we can promote stability in this region. These are the issues that we will confront today. These are the issues that are palpable all across the region. And I now request my senior colleague, Ambassador Rajan Abhyankar. I've had the privilege of serving under him twice, once as second secretary and then other at that time as ambassador, have benefited a lot from his knowledge and his personal experiences across our region. So Ambassador Abhyankar will then take off where I have left. Thank you very much. Ambassador.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Talmiz, for all these encomiums. Good morning. I think Talmiz has actually given us all the issues that we need to deal with. But let me start by slightly turning the focus to a slightly larger issue. Like marriages, we know that marriages have a 7-year itch. That's what they say. Nations have a 70-year itch. What do I mean by this? That if you see empirically, in the 70th year, or let's say the 7th decade, you find countries changing, you find issues changing. And nothing illustrates this more than what we see now, 70 years after the Second World War ended. The chronological trajectory you can actually identify. So what exactly happens? What happens is that established players take non-traditional roles. Think of Russia defending Syria's sovereignty, quite different from Crimea. You have new players coming onto the scene. Think of Qatar, or a whole lot of them. Then you have established institutions withering away or eroding. You have established ideologies splintering and taking different meanings. Let me give you some examples on a global scale. First is, we see a waning commitment to universal disarmament with the amount of laws that, with the amount of derogations from what we thought earlier, we see in the different agreements that have taken place, whether with India or with Iran. You see that the US command over the blue waters is waning. You see the growing irrelevance of UN institutions, and Syria is, of course, a classic case. You see the erosion of the total reliance on fossil fuels at the end of the Second World War. You see Jean Monnet's idea of Europe taking a beating thanks to the Eurozone crisis and the migration crisis. You see the challenge to Bretton Woods institutions by the Chinese bank, the AIIB, and our BRICS bank. So and you see a movement from GATT-based trade agreements to global value chain-based agreements. So you see that there's a huge change taking place. West Asia demonstrates all this. In fact, in my view, it is actually the epicenter of all the challenges that the so-called international order that we know and that we have been living under. I will actually, in this context, highlight 10 different trends that we need to look at in West Asia. First is, of course, the breakdown of the so-called cordon sanitaire, more or less, that Europe has been exercising vis-a-vis the southern and the eastern flanks of the Mediterranean. You have had, of course, the EU's neighborhood policy, this, that, and the other. All that has now broken down. It has become a more or less a seamless thing with millions of people trying to get into Europe because that is all that they see in terms of peace. Next, the impact of the Arab Spring, or so-called misnamed Arab Spring, which Talmiz mentioned. What we have seen now in the southern and the eastern part of the Mediterranean on the seaboard and inside is the end of so-called authoritative secularism that all these autocrats practiced, more to prolong themselves and, of course, as a measure of stability for the West. You see this happening from Ben Ali to not to Bashar Assad. And also, it meant the creation of a rentier economy where the people of the region of these countries never really benefited because the social contract that they exercised was completely flawed. That's provided them a stability in oil and gas supplies. But another thing that it did provide and which has come out today, thanks to the migration crisis, is that they became gatekeepers to ensure that populations from these countries did not go to the northern part of the Mediterranean. I mean, in countries where you need an exit visa to get out, there's no way that you could do it. Now there are no gatekeepers. And that's why you find migratory movements not just from the countries on the eastern seaboard, but in the hinterland on both. So you see people from Mali and from other places. The succumbing of the very pristine democracy movements in 2011, which much of the world was taken by and enthusiastic about, was to entrenched interests, whether it was in Jordan or Libya or Bahrain or Yemen and Syria is actually its most violent manifestation, because it's these entrenched interests, whether it was eventually the Muslim Brotherhood or others of their ilk, or whether it was the king's parties in some countries, their fight back to all these movements is pretty well illustrated in the movement from Mubarak to Mursi to Sisi. But as Talmiz mentioned, what it has spawned is Islamic radicalism, which now has spread across West, Central, and South Asia. And there doesn't seem to be an end to it because of the tremendous effect of their propaganda as well as their ideology to large sections of youth in all these countries who basically do not see themselves as stakeholders in these countries or do not feel that the system helps them. But apart from the struggle for Islam, a struggle within Islam actually, it's within Islam and within political Islam, what we need to say, what we also need to see is that this is really a struggle for power, for the assertion of political Islam over, and I think it has come to stay, whether we like it or not. We'll have to find ways to deal with it. It is something that has overtaken what you can say was an effete ideology of secularism, of unity, of solidarity, which is what the Arabs swore by. Syria, very evocatively, Syria has always called itself the bleeding heart of the Arab world. At no time has it been more important with the amount of bleeding that the Arabs are doing right now. Uh, then we come to the withdrawal of, or the uncertainty regarding US policy motives in the region. Basically, what we can say is that this pivot to Asia has meant a certain retrenchment of US power, both from the Mediterranean and from the Middle East. The abdication of that role has actually opened up a lot of many of these things that are happening. It has been further exacerbated by the fact that oil prices are down. They're $32, I think, right now, never have been as low. And the US is very steadily moving towards energy self-sufficiency. But at the same time, there does not seem to be any stomach in the US to take any kind of a strong role from what I can see. So that's where you are as far as the US is concerned. Whether they lead from behind, as Obama said, or don't lead at all is a matter of opinion. But parallelly, what we see is Iran's assertiveness and the beginning of new alignments. As I mentioned, this is one feature of what's going on, not just in the West Asia, but in the world, especially after the nuclear agreement between the P5+1 and Iran. There is a sense in the Arab world that this has meant growing proximity between Iran and the United States. And the effects of that you have seen in the breakdown of diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran after the assassination of Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr. And, but it has also spawned alliances which we never thought were possible. That between Saudi Arabia and Israel, US's two major pillars in the region, who now have made common cause in order to defeat or possibly filibuster through the US Congress, US policy vis-a-vis Iran. You then see the coalition of the willing, I don't know, some of them are unwilling, Sunni states put together by Saudi Arabia to fight terror, which I can only assume is a code for Iran. But it may not be, but it's interesting that the use of the word fighting terror is being used by Saudi Arabia vis-a-vis whoever they want to use it, and Bashar Assad for all the groups that are opposed to the Syrian regime. So fighting terror, so I suppose when terrorists come to Pathankot, we are again in that syndrome of whether people will, how much people will believe and go with us. The next point I wanted to make was, in confronting the Islamic State, of course, it is largely Western driven. But in my view, it has four flaws, the present strategy in confronting Islam. The first is, of course, the US and the West have had divided goals, whether to get Assad out first or whether to get ISIS first, and they're stuck in that. The second is the inability of the United States to cooperate with Russia, which has gone in there on its own because of the recent history of Crimea and what's going on in Ukraine. Then, of course, the inability because of the US Congress, even though the Republicans are vociferous on it, to put boots on the ground there or any of the others. And certainly not the regional powers. But the most important flaw is the lack of attention, or even possibly the inability, or whatever you want to call it, of wanting to fight ISIS at the ideological level as well, apart from the military level. Because in the end, whatever ISIS is propagating is probably the most retrograde and extreme interpretation of Islam. It's an idea. All religions have such extremists. You can't kill them. You might kill them, but it's not going to die. Think of the Muslim Brotherhood. In 1920, I mean, it was ruthlessly put down in the 70s in Syria, in other places. When does it come back? In 2011. So there are long quietest periods when these ideas are not going to die. The only way you can do it is to marginalize it. And I feel that all the Islamic powers, possibly under the OIC or some such format, have to sit together and look at it, because this is a problem within that religion. precious little that the Americans and others can do except have these drone attacks, aerial attacks, in which they're going to lose people, they're going to lose money, and they're going to get the odium, but that's their problem. What I feel is that this is an important issue that needs to be flagged. As far as the Syrian political process is concerned, finally, for the first time, you have Iran and Saudi Arabia sitting at the same table after the Vienna process, as they call it. It's supposed to start off at the end of this month, providing the list of the so-called terrorist groups who are excluded from this process other than Al-Qaeda and ISIS is made available or is decided or made. I believe Jordan is supposed to do this, but it hasn't happened yet. The other issue here is the rise of sub-nationalisms. The retrenchment of most other, not just retrenchment, the combat at different levels between various powers which tried to keep some kind of order has meant the spur to subnational identities like the Kurds. Even I'm told the Alawis, I mean in Syria, their fallback plan, I believe, is to actually go and hunker down in the area from Tartus up to Latakia and the anti-Lebanon range behind, because these all harken back to what happened in the past. The French had allowed an Alawi in the 20s for a few years, just like the Kurds had declared their independence again in the 20s before the whole thing was erased. So there could be others. The last is the major issue is now the humanitarian crisis, which because Syria's agriculture, I mean, why Syria? The entire West Asia's economy is destroyed, its agriculture is destroyed, and there are large numbers of people moving about. There are 11 million people reportedly displaced within Syria and 4 million waiting for succor somewhere else. So in the context of all this, what are the challenges for India? The first, I think, is we will have to learn to deal with governments based on political Islam. The old days when we looked at the secular part of all these governments is, I don't think. Second, we of course need to immunize our borders so that this radicalism does not come into India. But this is complicated on the one hand by, of course, the terrorist attacks that we get by radical groups from based in Pakistan, but also the homegrown elements and organizations like the IM and others. Third, as far as our diaspora in this region is concerned, which is 8 million now, this raises two issues. First is we need some viable plan to deal with any fear that may arise on the part of our diaspora should the instability that presently besets, of course, Iraq and Syria, comes down to the Gulf. Now, this is where I sort of have some sympathy with Talmiz's point that we may have to think of new things like intervening, because we have actually had Indian diaspora in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Libya. We have brought them back, but those were in tens of thousands. But here we are talking of millions. How exactly are you going to structure a viable, would it be necessary then for us to do what you suggested, that maybe we might need to have our boots on the ground? But it's a serious and a very difficult thing to, but this will happen. And that demand has come up, whether it was from Libya, way back Iraq when we were there first time during the Iraq-Iran war. It is a political issue in India, and the government is forced to do something. So the sooner we have some kind of viable plans, the better it is. Maybe we do, I am not aware of it. And parallelly, what we need to combat or factor in is the immediate fall in remittances and see how that can be made up. There are positive effects on India from what has happened. First is the gain on oil prices, and it has opened a window of opportunity for us to see how it can be used to attract foreign direct investment, because there's money also floating around which doesn't want to be parked in West Asia or many of the Mediterranean countries. But that requires us to actually do something in a or a mission mode or something to have projects which can be made available. Finally, on the Syrian peace process, we are part of the donor group, I believe, and we will of course do whatever we can like we did for Iraq also. But that's all. In the entire Vienna process, I doubt how much we were even involved or consulted, but this is one area where we need to see what we can do, considering, as we know, as we have established that we have very vital interest in the region. But more than that, we have this global strategic partnership with the United States. Why were we not brought in any way? That's a question. But we have got good relations with Iran and Saudi Arabia, and maybe there is a role for us there. Plus, also, the process will work on two tracks. One is a nationwide ceasefire to be brought in while the political process between Syrians and Syrians starts. Actually, it cannot start unless some peace comes, and we could probably contribute to that or take a lead in that. So thank you very much. I hope
Thank you, Ambassador, for your remarks. We will now move into our regular sessions, and the first session will be chaired by the distinguished journalist, Siddharth Vardarajan, a very old friend, and he will now take charge of the session here.